Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Gillian O'Shea Brown. Dr. Brown is a psychotherapist, complex trauma specialist, certified EMDR practitioner and consultant, and an author. As an adjunct professor of trauma at NYU, Dr. Brown's research enriched her understanding of attachment injury acquired through adverse childhood events and the treatment of complex layered trauma in childhood. Dr. Brown uses multiple integrative healing techniques based on her clients' individual needs and strives to provide clients with the best possible therapeutic care by understanding each person in the context of their own unique culture, values, and life experiences. So welcome to the show, Dr. Brown. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. And I just want to thank you for shining a light for so many people. This is a very powerful and culturally impactful podcast. And I hope you continue this really important work.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you for that. Also, I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Ireland, but I now have a private practice in New York City. And in the beginning of becoming a therapist, I noticed that for most people, their deepest pain came from their relationships, both past and present. And I became very curious about people's internalized negative beliefs, where shame comes from, where they learn these painful memories come from, and how negative beliefs get incorporated into the psyche. And that's how I landed on EMDR for unburdening and relieving trauma, internal family systems, which a lot of people are familiar with, which is your different parts of self, because a lot of the time when you're healing trauma, you're compassionately witnessing your earlier self from a place of safety. So you're working with multiple parts. And then I also use somatic techniques because no healing from trauma can occur until you feel safe in your body. So it's a bit of a personalized blend for each person. And I'm really happy to be here just to spread the word and circulate even more information for anyone that's on their healing journey or just in pre-contemplation.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And as we were talking, we got to know a little bit about each other. And I think that your background and just your knowledge base would be so beneficial for anyone that you work with, because you have such a broad range of knowledge, and the way that you incorporate everything that you know into what you do for your clients, I think is just so impactful and powerful.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. It's really more, I'll always feel like a perpetual student. And whatever you read for fun or for interest, if you can turn that into your full-time job, then you'll never feel like you're working. And you'll always want to learn more.
Agreed. Well, something that you also specialize in is trauma. And because of the work that you do, I wanted to ask a couple of questions to get your expert opinion on them. And the first one is, in your opinion, why are conversations about trauma so important?
Well, my definition of trauma is when your past intrudes upon your present and the unexamined history is doomed for repetition. Or to quote Freud, we repeat rather than remember. So I feel that when you start to talk about trauma, whether it's transgenerational trauma, childhood trauma, or different trauma patterns that are emerging in your life, by talking about it and expressing and inviting in compassionate witnessing to dissolve the shame and the secrecy, you're actually breaking the pattern and you're creating a new and compelling future. So the conversations and bringing it out of the darkness, it's a really important thing, because if we don't actually examine our past, it continues to repeat in painful and sinister ways. So the elixir to that wound is making it a really open, nourishing environment to talk about our traumas, our pains, our past mistakes, and the roots of shame.
It can be hard to do sometimes, though. So,
Yes.
especially for people who maybe didn't grow up in an environment where having conversations about their feelings or even traumatic events that they have experienced was something you can openly discuss.
Well, absolutely. I think for many of us, we grew up in environments where it was less socially taboo to drown your sorrows in a pub or a bar than it was to actually have a real and vulnerable conversation. And showing your psychological Achilles heel or your perceived weakness, it made you feel, defective or weird. And if every time you come to voice, you're met with minimizing or, don't say that, and it wasn't that bad, and you've no idea what I've been through, you learn that it's safer to keep things to yourself and not take up space and not ask for help. And that's why I think this podcast is so important, because you're kind of giving people permission to come to voice. And for most, the transgenerational messaging is to hide your trauma and suppress it and don't reveal it to anyone. But trauma leaves behind clues, and it comes to the surface in a whole array of different ways. So it's hard to bury your head in the sand, because it will come up one way or another. So it might as well be intentional.
Well, you just said so many things that I'm stealing. Emotional Achilles heel and trauma leaves behind clues. Those are good. Super good. What is the origin of the word trauma?
So it came from the Greek, which, was the word wound, and it could be a mental or psychological wounding that occurred. And then, when we think about the word wounding, there's trauma and there's complex trauma. And I know you have a list of questions, and I'm jumping ahead. I apologize.
You're good.
Complex trauma is kind of like multiple wounding, like the death by 1,000 cuts. Like there's many different wounds rather than one big T trauma. There's, subtle kind of sinister boundary violations, manipulations, communication deviance, loyalty binds. It can be more hidden and sinister and subtle and beneath the surface.
I think if we look at trauma as wounding, it kind of gives a different vantage point and perspective to what's actually happening, because physical wounds, I don't think a lot of us would just say, I broke my arm, but I don't want to talk about it. So
yes.
If we look at trauma the same way we look at physical wounds, wounding is wounding.
Yes. Yeah. And no matter how much you ignore your broken arm, it's not going to heal alone.
Exactly.
Or it's not going to heal correctly or in an adaptive way.
Right. It may heal, but it might heal out of place, which now means you're walking around with the effects of not dealing with your wound, because your arm is going in a different direction.
Absolutely. As you're saying with this analogy, if you ignore it and you don't take care of it, it might heal in a very maladaptive way, where then other parts have to compromise and everything gets out of alignment and a little bit more vulnerable, and your psyche is not that different to the anatomy in that way.
So
it's a good analogy.
Yeah. And comparing the psyche to the physical body and to the anatomy, I mean, I think that's all we really have to do in order to have a better understanding of trauma. Because if your psyche is
Yeah.
no different than your anatomy, then why aren't we dealing with the wounds that our psyche has?
Yeah. Why is it that emotional wounding became a secret, sinister, shameful thing that can't be talked about? And how did we learn that? And how did that get passed down from one generation to another?
Exactly. I think that's a conversation in and of itself. I wanted to talk about your book a little bit. Healing
Okay.
Complex PTSD, a clinician's guide. What was your vision with
Yeah.
this book?
So the book was written in 2021, and a little bit of history, if that's okay. Back in 1992, Judith Herman kind of released a book where she was naming this experience of complex trauma, relational trauma. She spoke of prisoners of childhood, children that feel trapped, walking on eggshells in a volatile, unpredictable setting. She talked about intimate partner violence and feeling chronically unsafe for a really long time. And it took 30 years of petitioning Bessel van der Kolk, Judith Herman, to get it into, as a formal diagnosis. And it has not yet been included in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, but it did get incorporated into the ICD, which is, the International Classifications of Disorders Manual, as a formal diagnosis in 2021. So I had been, working in the field of relational trauma and publishing papers and chapters and researching. And I wanted to put together a manual for therapists and for students so that they could really understand complex PTSD. And to, first off, when something's not a formal diagnosis, everyone has a different definition of what it is, and there's no uniform, this is the set criteria. So everyone was singing off of a different hymn sheet. And then to go into the evidence-based modalities for the most effective treatment, how it impacts the body, how it impacts memory, disassociation, relationships, how it impacts the clinical dyad. So it was a very practical manual. But if I'm very honest with you, it was not the book I had in my heart. It wasn't the book I wanted to write. It was a very pragmatic decision. You saw me quoting or heard me quoting the psychological Achilles heel. I love the classics. I love mythology, and the book I have wanted to write and that I've written is merging mythology with education around trauma and healing and the psychospiritual components of coming from a place from pain into healing. So the first book was a very grounded, evidence-based, academic kind of project. And the second book is much more psycho-spiritual and accessible to everyone. And hopefully something that someone can say, I'm going to give this book to someone that I love and they'll understand my pain. And this will put words to my lived experience.
Wow. I think if that is the goal and the aim of what you want to accomplish with the book, that is going to be life changing for so many people, because not everybody can not everybody can put a name to their lived experience and articulate it well. So to have someone like yourself say, here, use this, that's such a gift.
Well, I guess it's a little bit like what you mentioned earlier, in terms of, in the aftermath of George Floyd, it woke something up within you and created this deep hunger for knowledge and curiosity about trauma, pain, transgenerational legacy burdens. And you started to, through your own reading and research and curiosity, find words and a language to put together and make meaning of what you were experiencing in your life and in your family history. And having that shared language, it then gives you permission to have deep conversations. And that's very cathartic. It's very unburdening to finally have the words. And so many trauma survivors live in secrecy, silence, and shame without the language, without the words. And growing up, I loved Aesop's fables. Do you know Aesop's fables?
Mm-mm.
Like they would use little animals and they would teach life lessons through the animals, like slow and steady wins the race, or they'd use these animal metaphors to teach deeper life lessons and metaphors. And I thought it was really nice to use something that feels familiar and accessible and like a story to convey topics that we run away from and we hide from, or we say that's too complicated. I don't want to research it. So I feel like turning it into a sequence of stories, it makes it something you can share easily.
I agree. It makes it more easy to palate.
Yeah, palatable. Yes, that was the goal.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to read it. And I hope that anyone who receives your offering, that your goal is accomplished through them and through their ability to share it with someone else and say, this is what I need to tell you. And I wasn't able to, but here's the words for it.
Well, I hope so. And I'll definitely be sending you a copy. And you'll have to give me an opinion.
I will 100% do that. I wanted to ask you a personal question. What was it that got you into therapy and wanting to be in this field?
Yeah, well, as I said before, trauma leaves behind clues, and you notice these, symptoms within yourself in terms of your internal thoughts, your relationship with your body, how it feels to trust and to express. And therapy really taught me how to feel. Being a person that was very emotionally repressed, there was a point in my life when I bragged that I hadn't cried in 20 years. And that was a badge of honor. And I guess the collective consciousness of Ireland, where I'm from, is not to feel and not to express, and definitely don't show your weakness. And mental health was really not known about when I was growing up. You would say that people suffered from their nerves, or there was something wrong with them. And it was something that created shame or exile and judgment. And therapy was a very disparate and taboo kind of foreign thing to even think about. And it wasn't something I became familiar with until I got older, and I was working with children in the child protection system. I was working with recent and retrospective survivors of child sexual abuse, and I would do the forensic interviewing for court reports, in terms of getting as much information from them as possible. And our goal was to do very detailed interviews where they wouldn't have to be asked the same thing again. Because every time you tell your story, it's re-traumatizing. You will look at the person's face and say, am I saying too much? Am I saying too little? And your recollection of what happened diffuses every time you tell the story. And so many of these children, I felt like, I really wish I could continue this with you and take the pain away. And they would ask, do you do therapy? Do you do counseling? And from there, I decided I moved to the US, and I decided to formally get trained at the National Institute of Psychotherapies and Trauma Healing. And I've just been expanding my toolbox ever since. Whenever I get an interesting case, where I can't help someone, I would kind of look for the answer and, do an extra training. And there was an early client I had very early on, a young girl who was very religious, and she came in with intrusive thoughts, and her intrusive thoughts were that there was feces on her face and a soiled tampon in her mouth. And I knew to ask from my previous training, it sounds like in a lot of these, intrusive images and thoughts, the body is a source of intrusion and the body feels dirty. And was there a time when you had an intrusion trauma that made you feel dirty? And from there, for the very first time in her life, she disclosed that she had been abused, sexually abused. And her intrusive thoughts and flashbacks and night terrors, that was the case that led me down the road of EMDR. And then through my clients, some of them had more somatic-based symptoms. Some of them had, different ego states or different parts of self. And over the years, I've just been continuously expanding my healing toolbox. And I've just really enjoyed seeing a person transform in front of your eyes and become unburdened from their pain, the meaning they made of their trauma. And it's a bit like when, Michelangelo said when he was carving the David, the angel was always in the marble and I carved until I set it free. I sometimes feel like I'm a sculptor and I'm carving away at the defense mechanisms. I'm carving away at the fears, the meaning they made of painful life events. And then underneath all of that is the true, real, unburdened person in the world. And when I see that, it gives me just an immense source of pleasure. And I'm hoping that, with my books, that other people, that goes beyond me in my practice and it's out there in the world and it's something that can be shared. And maybe people can even create a little bit of that for themselves, even if they don't have the time or the resources for therapy, that by reading, the books and materials or just sharing that knowledge, they can spread the word.
I'm so glad I asked that question. Oh my God, that was that was so amazing. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for the people that you've helped and for continuing to expand your knowledge base so that you can be so much more for the people that need you and for your clients. Like I said, I'm so glad I asked that question because it wasn't part of the outline, but the answers you just gave were tremendous. And I think just being able, that one story you talked about, the girl being able to help her with the abuse that you uncovered with her, that could be so helpful for anyone who listens to this and maybe suffering and not knowing what's really going on or having intrusive thoughts. But man, thank you for that. That was so powerful.
Well, when you have a lot of intrusion on your body or in your mind, if you can lean into the discomfort of becoming acquainted with the wound and say, isn't that interesting? Because behind every behavior is a feeling and behind every feeling is a need. And if you can sit with it with enough curiosity and compassion, it will often lead you down to the roots of the trauma at the beginning. And it's kind of like when you read a novel, the prologue of the story or the beginnings, the origins of the story, it brings everything together and it makes everything make sense,
Well, you are, I feel, making sense of a lot of things that people may not understand or have access to, or the tools and resources to be able to figure out what's going on with them. And I'm so grateful to have an opportunity to let the world listen to what you do and how you do it, because I'm fascinated by just listening to you and your stories.
Well, thank you so much. And, I really appreciate that you're finding different healers and their different modalities and spreading the word. And giving people a portal for resonance and understanding. I feel like a lot of people listen to this podcast and they come away saying, I learned something and I feel understood.
Well, that is the goal. And if that is what's happening, that would make me so happy, because I, for the longest time, struggled with trying to understand my behaviors and why, I had certain feelings. And it was just like I had a map, but I couldn't read it. So therapy for me gave me the clues and the direction that I needed to go into to, like we spoke about earlier, to find myself. And then once I found me, I was able to unburden the parts of myself, and still am unburdening the parts of myself that needed so much work and care and compassion because of everything that I was carrying. And that is something that I wanted to share with anyone else who needed it. So that was the goal behind the podcast. And when I have the opportunity to sit with you and individuals like you, and I can hear the things that you're saying, I know that if it's still something that deeply resonates with me and gives me so much peace and understanding, that it has to be something that others will benefit from as well.
And, when you get that feeling on the inside of, I'm in the right place at the right time, asking the right questions, you just know that you're living your purpose. It's a very special feeling to have.
It is. It is, for sure. All right, let me get back to the outline. So much emphasis is being put on our early years and the impact childhood development has on our lives. And you go in detail about how children create an emotional map. So
yeah.
I wanted to ask, what is an emotional map and how can someone understand it?
Well, an emotional map is when you're growing up, you make meaning of the world and you learn, how do I trust? Who can I love? How do I survive? Am I lovable? If I ask for what I need, will I be helped? Am I connected? Am I good enough? Am I worthy? And this gets incorporated into the emotional map, and we repeat these old patterns in ways big and small into adulthood. And these beliefs get reinforced over time. And what often happens in the case of trauma survivors is that with the emotional map, they've learned early on that they're not lovable, or they're not worthy, they're not good enough, they're not in control, they're not safe, they're powerless, they're defective. And this gets activated through painful life events, or what I like to call the bite that fits the wound. And every time that original pain gets activated, the compounded impact of the pain is very re-traumatizing for an individual. And this is kind of the diathesis stress model of PTSD, where there's an original vulnerability, but then there's the onset of a lot of stress that kind of amplifies it and brings it out even more. So getting to know your emotional map is important, because even if you've lost years of your life to trauma, pain, and shame, there's always a journey back to yourself. And going back to the origin of the story and understanding how you learned, these beliefs and how you made meaning of the world, it's never too late to come back to yourself and to revise that emotional map and to start a new chapter of your life.
I had never heard of an emotional map before your book, and it made so much sense. And I was really excited to give you an opportunity to explain what an emotional map is, because for me, it was something that was kind of like one of those aha moments. And I think that a lot of people can have that same response to it, because it just makes sense. It gives you an idea of what may have been going on underneath the surface without really knowing it. It's kind of one of those things where you can put a name to something that you have been feeling and experiencing.
Well, that means a lot, because I wanted to demystify the whole trauma and healing experience and try to make it really simple and easy to understand in kind of incremental steps that help you to identify the roots of the belief, the patterns, and then find a way forward. So the fact that it evoked a feeling of excitement and resonance is really lovely to hear.
Yeah, I think you did what you were looking to do, because like I said, that's one of those things that now I put a pin in, and I will always use the term emotional map, because it,
Wow.
number one, is relatable, and it allows someone to actually have kind of a word picture in their mind of
Yeah.
how they could have been on a journey emotionally, and they
Yeah.
can piece things together.
Absolutely. And in the second book, I purposefully didn't put in any diagnosis or any words that would pathologize the experience, and everything's very neutral. And in the world of psychology, the emotional map would be, what's your attachment injury, or what's your attachment status, or negative schemas. But just giving really open and neutral language, it allows more people to identify with it in a way that's not shaming.
Layman's terms.
Yeah, yeah. Just going back to, what we all know. Because language is interesting. I feel like in the academic world, it's almost used to alienate and to create divide. And really, you don't know a topic well unless you can explain it to a 5-year-old. So take away all the jargon, take away all of the unnecessary frills, explain it really plainly and simply, and then more people can benefit from the knowledge.
And that's always the goal, is to allow as many people as possible to have access to it and to benefit from it. So.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another thing I wanted to mention is that trauma is sometimes compared to an onion, because you have to peel back each layer one by one.
Yeah.
How can trauma become layered, and what happens as you start to process and deconstruct trauma?
Well, this is very interesting because one of my clients comes to mind as you ask that question. And in the beginning, when I work with people, I have them fill in this adverse childhood experiences questionnaire. And it's basically 10 questions that range from, did your parents get divorced? Was there a person in your family that had mental health issues? Were you ever hit as a child? Were you ever made to feel special? Did anyone ever take you to take care of your healthcare needs? And I remember with him specifically, he got a pretty low, like it was like a 1 or a 2 out of 10. But as we started to work together and process memories associated to feeling powerless and not in control, and he started peeling back the layers and, working with each core target memory, a bank of repressed memories came to the surface that really evidenced these feelings of being powerless and not in control. And the unconscious mind is such a powerful thing. And we sometimes don't get access to full memories until we feel safe enough to hold them. And sometimes, or a lot, I've noticed that when I'm processing painful memories, because there's a quote from Francine Shapiro, and she says that everybody has 10 to 20 memories in their life responsible for all of the pain. And processing each memory with EMDR or IFS is like taking a log out of the fire. And as we start to take these logs out of the fire, diffuse the pain, change the meaning of the event, compassionately witness the wounded younger child, often what comes to the surface are deep-rooted trauma. And I've had people that have experienced, pre-verbal traumas that have come to the surface, or deeply hidden repressed memories that were just below conscious awareness. And it truly is an onion. I agree with you in that regard, that as you go into the process, you discover more. But I like to think of it as exfoliation, where you want to gently peel back the layers, but not be too aggressive or not expose things that might feel raw or too painful. You want to gently challenge, but also there's a duty of care. So in therapy and in life, that the duty of care versus the dignity of risk is very important, where you always want to grow and challenge, but you also have to take care of yourself and, be gentle.
You broke that down very well. And I like the analogy of taking the logs out of the fire or exfoliating, because if we look at trauma as a furnace with a fire in it, and the
Mm-hmm.
logs are keeping the fire going, if you
Mm-hmm.
remove the source of fuel from the fire, it will eventually go out. And if we can look at trauma as that fire and
Yeah,
processing painful memories and peeling back layers carefully and slowly, and if that is removing fuel from the fire, then the fire of trauma will eventually go out.
exactly. And what fuels the fire, as you said, is these memories that are unspoken about, where they keep replaying the most painful parts, like a skipping disc or vinyl, where the intrusive thoughts, images, or the shame based beliefs keep coming up intrusively. And by actually taking them out and, compassionately witnessing, processing, it takes away the power of those painful memories and they don't haunt you like they used to.
I love how much emphasis you're putting on doing it compassionately and slowly, because that's so important.
Well, often when people come for trauma processing, they're saying things out loud for the first time, or it's the first time they've revealed something. And the childlike interpretation of how they felt when it originally happened is still very active within them. And children take much more accountability for things that happen to them than they should.
Mm.
And it's actually, it's called the moral defense, where you have so little control over your life as a child, where you can't say, this person's really toxic, I'm going to take a break from them. And the bullies in the schoolyard or the antagonizers at home are to be put up with silently. And you can learn to fawn and blame yourself. So when somebody's coming in with early childhood trauma, there's often a meekness and an apologetic kind of energy and a shame. And when somebody, privileges you with their pain and puts their heart on a platter like that, the softness is key. The compassionate witnessing is key.
I love that, because, like you said, someone could be speaking these things for the first time, and there could be so much shame and guilt associated with the childlike parts of them that are needing to be unburdened, and you would have to deal with them similar to a child,
Yeah, yeah.
because that is the emotional age range, I would say, maybe, that they may be stuck in, for lack of a better term, associated with those emotions. So
I
giving them
totally,
that childlike compassion is super helpful.
well, if a part of you got stuck in a painful time and place where the event was so painful and the magnitude of it was so painful and the meaning you made of it was so shameful, a part of you gets frozen and stuck in that time. And
Mm.
often when you are processing trauma, you may be talking directly to a person's wounded inner child, and you can tell by their body language and their tone of voice and the use of language that they are really transporting back to that earlier time. And that's when you know that you're going deep into becoming acquainted with that core original wound.
Exactly. And kind of bridging off of this, when I was researching and learning about all of the symptoms, the consequences, the behaviors, and the
Yeah.
burdens that trauma survivors carry, it made me think of um, the reality of what a lot of us are dealing with. Like these things are huge, and
Hmm.
trauma isn't something that you can just get over or that having a positive attitude would fix. And it made me think of like comparing trauma to a disabled person who may be in a wheelchair and saying to them, stand up. And if they can't, then shaming them for not being able to, but they actually have a full blown disability where they're unable or unable to do it. Um,
Well, I agree with what you're saying, but also I believe that post traumatic stress is an injury and not a disorder because I really strongly believe in the capacity for healing. And when that injury is, processed with the proper evidence based modalities, which is from the World Health Organization, trauma focused CBT and EMDR. And that will change in 10 years' time. The research is always ongoing. Um, you can see real and meaningful change in people. So I really strongly believe in healing, and I've seen it. I've seen people move through their pain into a place of healing. And there isn't just post traumatic stress, there's also a concept called post traumatic growth. And you, in particular, are such an emotionally intelligent and astute and compassionate individual. And some of that is not despite your trauma, but because of it, and you might notice that in the way that you parent or how you are in your partnership, that you've taken the pain of your past and the practice wisdom of living through that, and you've applied it to creating a life that you feel proud of, that gives you purpose and meaning.
I'm trying. I appreciate you saying that. I think that I notice now that reparenting is something. Reparenting myself not only gives my son something more and better than what I received, and not to associate any blame or shame or guilt. I just think that when you know better, especially emotionally, you can do better. So as I
Absolutely.
reparent him, I'm also
Mm-hmm.
benefiting from seeing myself be able to give something that I didn't get in a manner that is done with intent and purpose and compassion.
Wow. So being an attentive, purposeful, passionate father, it has been a very corrective and healing experience for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because
It
it
is because it's happening. Yeah.
it's making you think about what it is to be a father and what is fatherhood, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah. I see it as a life lesson for the adult version of me, and
Yeah.
also healing the parts of myself that maybe didn't get what I'm giving as a child too. So it's beneficial on two levels because I get to see my son have
Yeah.
emotional development that I'm also learning with him now. So in a few aspects of parenting him, we're learning and growing together
Wow.
because I'm
So
getting some of the same things that he's getting now because I'm
yeah,
experiencing them for the first time also.
what kind of things?
So, for instance, I would get super uncomfortable when he would show affection to me because
Oh,
I felt that maybe I
mm-hmm.
wasn't deserving of it, or um, am I going to do something wrong? I was hyper vigilant in my acceptance of his affection because when he would show me affection, it would activate childlike parts of me that were needing to still have, some work done or to be seen and heard. And now I'm
Yeah.
actively able to notice the activation, pause, regulate, and then accept what's happening in the moment and not be stuck in what am I doing wrong, or why is it happening, or being uncomfortable.
Wow. So, going back to you accept the love you believe you deserve. When your son is affectionate towards you, you've revised your emotional map and you now welcome the warmth and the affection and it feels good and natural. But before it felt strange and unfamiliar and you didn't really know if you were worth it or deserving or you were going to mess something up. And you've been healing yourself while you've been attentively fathering and loving him. So it's really powerful.
It is, and I feel calm now. I mean, I still do get a bit of a activation, but I'm able to work through it and understand why it's happening and just let it go. I can say, okay, I understand. I know that you think that maybe this or that is going to happen, but it's not. Just accept him and receive it.
So you're able to listen from within and negotiate with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Which is huge for me.
It's huge. Yeah. That's a really wonderful tool of self-awareness to develop and evolve. And it takes a long time to be able to do that. It takes a lot of self-study and inner work to be able to negotiate with the earlier, more wounded parts of yourself and challenge yourself, have a willpower challenge to, venture into the unfamiliar and trust yourself.
I think just being able to talk about it too, especially without getting nervous or feeling uncomfortable, that is also a win, because when I would explain it to people, they would look at me kind of like confused. Well, it's your son. And I would say, I know, like, I don't understand why it's happening. But the more curious I got with the actual feeling, the more I was able to dive into it and kind of get some more information from it to find out why it was happening and what I could do to correct it and be better.
Which is really powerful, because when we look at the different trauma modalities for healing, they all basically, come from the premise of this internal wisdom from within, an internal knowing self. And if you were to look at symptoms or abreactions or defense mechanisms as, information, and I'm going to listen to this information and I'm going to hear from it and understand it, then you know that you're really mastering, your healing and your self-study. That's when you know that you're really ahead of the game and you're doing it independently. I hope that's something you're able to. But I hope it's something you teach your son and you bring it down the generations. You'll find someday he will be having an internal struggle or he'll be grappling with something difficult, and you will guide him in terms of listening from within. That would be a really beautiful thing for you to pass down to your generational line.
Yeah, instead of trauma, to be able to pass down tools.
To
I
pass
hope to
down.
be able to do that.
Yeah, your healing wisdom.
Yeah.
That would be
a great gift. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
I remember learning about childhood trauma and how it can show up later in life through behaviors, and learning that childhood trauma survivors will do anything to feel good, no matter what the risks are, even if it means losing their jobs, their livelihood, their families, etc.
Yeah.
And it was something that they didn't necessarily have control over. It was just the behaviors would give them a feeling, and that feeling was something that they needed or wanted. What can be some other behaviors that can be seen or that you've seen in trauma survivors?
So for a lot of trauma survivors, whether it's childhood trauma or big T trauma, where they feel chronically unsafe, or there's been moments where, they've been cognitively hyper-aroused or they've been in fight or flight, they often feel chronically unsafe in their body, and the body becomes a source of pain, shame, and intrusion. And they don't have the tools to get back into what we call the window of tolerance, or you could say when you feel most yourself. So a lot of trauma survivors will ritualistically compulsive comfort seek. They'll look for a numbing agent to try to feel good. And for some people, that can be disordered eating. For others, it can be promiscuity or risky behaviors. It could be, sex addiction, shopping addiction, compulsive spending, substances, and or even gambling. And it's this ritualistic compulsive comfort seeking or numbing or distracting to try to take away the pain momentarily as a way to try to feel safe and in control. And no healing from trauma can occur until you feel safe and regulated in your body. That is the foundational step of all of the trauma healing modalities. And, these behaviors, it's important to look at them, through the lens of behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. So, the trauma survivor that, let's say that they go through a stage of sexual promiscuity that puts them in risky, shameful situations. That's the behavior. It's a pattern of behavior. And the feeling is that it gives them closeness now and makes them feel desirable. And it's fulfilling a feeling of wanting to feel wanted. And when you examine it with the trauma survivor, they realize this is antagonizing and rubbing salt into the wound and not creating any relief. You're actually able to get to the roots of when did you learn that you weren't good enough? And what is the corrective experience that you crave the most? So these behaviors, these cyclical, self-soothing, distracting, numbing behaviors, they're very much part of the trauma experience.
Wow. The way that you keep showing the path to the root of the actual trauma is so mind-blowing, because would you say behind every behavior is a feeling?
Mm-hmm. And behind every feeling is need.
That's powerful.
So it kind of brings you back.
Yeah, that doesn't leave any room for you not to address the root cause if you look at it just using that.
Yes.
You can't avoid at that point, because a lot of us, we try to avoid feeling our feelings or dealing with our root causes, but just that one simple sentence that burns the bridge. You have to see it and deal with it.
Well, Freud came up with the pleasure pain principle, and we're hardwired to go towards pleasure and away from pain. So I try to motivate people to understand what it is. If they were healed from their trauma and if therapy was going really well for them, what kind of changes would they want to see in their life? How would they know? What would their life look like? And only when you feel motivated to lean into the discomfort can you tolerate the pain of going into the past, because nobody eagerly looks into a past of trauma and pain without the motivation of, well, what am I going to get out of it? How will this serve me? And, I feel like you have to motivate a person in terms of what's in it for them before they're willing to go into the dark corners of their psyche or the chapters of their book that they would rather never read again,
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of sense. What is repetition compulsion, and how is that related to trauma?
Mm-hmm. So that was, it's a quote from Freud from the early 1900s. And repetition compulsion is our inclination as humans to repeat rather than to remember, or to reenact and relive painful experiences. So the classic trauma survivor that would come to me, they will have a core negative belief that I will hear in the way that they talk about their trauma. And it could be, I'm not good enough, I'm not in control, I'm not safe. And then when you do the contextual floatbacks of when was an earlier time when you were made to feel this way, you'll notice that there's a reliving of the same pattern over and over again. And repetition compulsion can kind of happen in many different ways. It could be that you grew up in an environment where you pined for the love you pined for the parent whose love you crave the most, and you unconsciously married someone with those exact same traits as a way of trying to resolve the puzzle. It's a type of pain that you know that you can live with, and you want to rewrite the past. And the easiest way of me describing repetition compulsion to you is that if we were together in a big group and we all put our problems in a circle and you could choose any problems again, we would probably choose our own problems again because we have a desire to resolve them. We know how it goes. It's a pain we can tolerate. We want to relive the past. And for this reason, there's a human inclination to relive and reenact painful life experiences. And we see this with people that go into their past relationship history and they see a pattern of the same type of archetype coming up over and over again. Or it could be other life situations. And, the thing about repetition compulsion, or what I like to call is the bite that fits the wound, is every time this old pain gets activated, it can be really dysregulating for the person and their autonomic nervous system. And that is why, going to the roots is so helpful, because when you know where it all begins, then you can identify patterns and then you can understand better and make informed decisions. Because for me, healing is operating from a place out of deep self-awareness rather than classic conditioning.
This may seem like a silly question, but is it possible to experience trauma and not be affected physically?
Yes. There's a lot of people that, you mean that there's no physiological response?
Right. Like
Or
maybe it doesn't affect your nervous system, or you don't have any physical manifestations of the actual trauma in your body.
Well, it could be that there could be a lot of sensation, or there could be a sense of numbness where you feel disconnected from your body. It can also be the meaning you made of the event at the time and how it informed the story you tell yourself about yourself. And if something happened where the meaning you made of it was that the world is not a safe place and you can't trust anyone and you're not safe and you're a bad person, then that past life event is intruding upon your present, and that is a traumatic event. So it's not always based in the body, and sometimes there is a body-based imprint, but it's more a numb, disassociative place where you learn not to feel pain or to deny pain or to suppress and decompartmentalize from pain. So, trauma is very unique and individual to every survivor, and the cluster of symptoms can vary greatly from one person to the next.
So if someone is suppressing or avoiding their trauma, they may not be having a physical or physiological effect from it in the moment or at present, but is that something that can eventually catch up to them?
Well, as you peel back the layers on the trauma, first off, usually in a therapy setting, there's a present day trigger or something they want to work through. Sorry, bear with me.
No problem.
And it's not always body based. For some people, it can be more the way that they learned to become maybe overly self-reliant and not trust, or dependent and attaching without discernment. And it can be more behavioral and more cognitive than somatic. And the body, it has to feel regulated and safe in the beginning of trauma. But if there isn't a somatic sensation or symptom, I don't go looking for it, and I don't wait for it, because if it organically comes up, it comes up. And if it's not there, then the manifestation of the trauma is more in terms of beliefs and behavioral patterns. Does that answer your question?
It does. Okay. So I saw one of your posts on Instagram, and it was something that I never really thought about.
Yeah.
And it talked about having a high sex drive. And I wanted to ask, can a high sex drive be a sign of trauma?
Yeah, that was an article that I worked on with the Huffington Post, where they were exploring the roots of hypersexuality, which is kind of, addiction is a very fluid thing, and people with addictions will know that there's a ritualistic compulsive comfort seeking where they're seeking to numb or get away from pain. And in terms of, having a high libido is one thing. But if you are continuously in situations where without discernment, you're choosing sexual experiences with people you don't know or trust that are disrespectful or re-traumatizing, you could be reliving old pain over and over again. And again, interoception is such a powerful thing, and that's your ability to read with the body and say, is it a yes or is it a no? Am I choosing this experience? And a lot of trauma survivors will have a fawning response or a pathological accommodation response where they're so accommodating it's a problem, and they don't know how to say no or set boundaries or self-advocate. And choosing partners without discernment and getting into risky, re-traumatizing situations, it's another form of indirect self-harm from potentially somebody that wants closeness now, or they feel some level of punishing themselves. So it's one of the many manifestations of the ritualistic compulsive comfort seeking. And for many trauma survivors that do have a sex addiction, they're just trying to feel connected to someone else and embodied, to feel connected with their own body. But, in fact, and I've seen this with my clients, they're feeling even more unsafe and shameful in the world. So it's certainly something that's synonymous with childhood emotional abuse and neglect, and something that absolutely comes up in the context of trauma treatment.
Wow, that is deep. Especially trying to feel connected to their own body through someone else's body. That is something I never would have thought about.
Well, if you think of someone that grew up in a household where there was no emotional warmth and no affection, and they felt very kind of maybe unseen or disconnected, often the unseen child becomes the promiscuous adult because it's a way of trying to get closeness now. But it's also very damaging to the ego, and painful.
Oh, that's so deep. Thank you for answering that question in such a good and meaningful way, because it gave a lot of insight on what childhood trauma and not having connection as a child how it can manifest later on as an adult in ways that may not be the most productive. So, all right. So I wanted to ask you a question about beliefs and what impact our beliefs can have on us. And I wanted you to, if you could, talk about the example of Rodney that you mentioned in chapter 7 of your book.
Oh, okay. So in the book, Rodney is a person that, he grows up in a household where, there is a lot of emotional abuse. And, that's how he learns that emotional closeness is conflict and chaos and trauma, and that you accept the love you believe you deserve. And when you're surrounded by that, you internalize the belief. And, he unconsciously, below conscious awareness, gets into relationship with people that antagonize this wound and reinforce those old negative beliefs. And it's very much repetition compulsion, or the bite that fits the wound, where, we will unconsciously find partners that are reminiscent to the parent whose love we crave the most, and reliving that pain because it's familiar. And another type of love would be jarring and strange. And, what if I don't deserve this? Or what if I ruin it? And for most people, there's a very strong parallel between their current romantic life and the way that they were made to feel in terms of closeness, connection, safety, nurturance, guidance, protection in their formative years. So in the book, Rodney is a person that, the unexamined history is doomed to repetition. He has, below conscious awareness, found himself reliving the same pain again, reinforcing all those old negative beliefs. I hope that answered your question.
It did. I just wanted to give a little bit of, I guess, insight on how our beliefs can affect who and what we are as an adult, especially if they were molded in childhood, and they can have sometimes limit us in what we do or how we feel.
Well, absolutely. The internalized beliefs of I'm not worthy, or I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable. You can only accept the kind of love that's congruent to your belief system. So if you have a lot of these old, painful, self-limiting beliefs that haven't been revisited or haven't been challenged, you're going to make choices that are in alignment with the unworthiness. And, you're going to feel really uncomfortable asking for what you need, setting boundaries, having higher standards. And you will often unconsciously relive the pain. And that's why going back and examining the history and unburdening from where you learned those beliefs is so key, because beliefs are incredibly powerful and they shape your identity, your perception of the world, your sequence of decision making. And if you think about it with the journey of life, all it is a sequence of decisions that are made one after another every single day. And the culmination of that is the life's journey. And we will always make decisions according to our values and beliefs.
There it is. I think you you hit that one out the park, because our beliefs, we are our beliefs, and we make every decision we make is based on what we believe about ourselves. And most of our beliefs are developed at an early age by our environments. So that has a huge impact on what we do and why we do.
Absolutely. It's very, very true.
So there was something that you said that I want to quote, and you said, "We were all once children, and still that inner child resides within us. But most adults are unaware of this. This lack of conscious relatedness to the inner child is precisely where so many emotional, behavioral, and relational difficulties stem from." So if someone is unaware of this, what can they do with the awareness now to connect and heal with that inner child?
Well, thank you for sharing that quote. I feel partially responsible for that. It's also paraphrasing, some of the work of Carl Jung, who invented the inner child archetype. So in terms of listening from within, there might be parts of your life that you feel really comfortable and confident in. And then there might be parts that create a lot of fear and uncertainty and insecurity. And listening from within and kind of hearing from your earlier self. And, when there are avoidance or self-sabotage or numbing behaviors to kind of say, isn't that interesting? And, again, going back to what we said before about behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. Most of those needs are around safety, nurturance, and guidance. They're very basic human needs. I want to feel loved. I want to feel safe. I want to feel protected. I want to feel connected. And these are basic needs that should be fulfilled in childhood. And when they're not, when they're chronically unmet and there's an insatiable hunger, they often come out in adulthood in a whole array of different ways. So, go with the clues or go with the perceived present day triggers or problems, and it will always guide you back to the origins and that inner child that exists within everyone. It really just wants a compassionate witness and a steadiness and a guiding, just like any child. And, connecting with it will help you to grow beyond your wildest measure. So I encourage a lot of people to go within. And on my Instagram and TikTok, I share a lot of exercises in terms of getting in touch with your inner child. Very simple journal techniques, meditative prompts. And these are things that you can do by yourself, or you could do with a friend, or you could bring them into the therapy room. And they're just little portals or little avenues of getting connected and going back to, the prologue of your story and where it all began.
So kind of building off of the tools that you just said that you share on social media, the last question I wanted to ask you is if you could use your platform to encourage someone who may be struggling with feeling uncomfortable or their big feelings and emotions, and they want to talk to someone, but they don't know where to start or where to begin, what would you say to them?
That's a really good question. So first off, I would hope that if someone stumbled across my page or my work, that they would start to have the realization of, my past is intruding on my present. And it's not that there's something wrong with me, but something happened. And, sometimes people, their life is on hold because they're waiting for an apology from the person that hurt them, or they're waiting for that person to evolve emotionally or take ownership and accountability. And that, for many, never happens. And the healing has to come from within first. And you can't have your life on hold while you wait for your abuser or your antagonizer to reform their character. The healing begins within you. And, whether you're exposing yourself to the teachings of trauma, online that are free available resources, or there's a close friend that maybe you have a shared trauma with or a deep resonance that you can begin to privilege, or you've decided that you feel ready enough to go to therapy, or even as simple as going to the yoga mat. I'm also a registered yoga teacher, and anything that helps you to feel connected with your body and shows up with yourself in a caring, compassionate way is a big step. And there are so many different avenues that will lead you down the healing pathway, and it's individual for every person. And I hope that the person has a sense of joy and optimism and curiosity as they try many different ways of getting to know their wound and healing their symptoms and, connecting with others in a deep and more meaningful way. But I would caution people not to put their whole life on hold for the apology that they've been waiting for that may never come.
Well, thank you for that. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to do this with you. I love this conversation. I think we talked about so many things that are deeply helpful and meaningful to a lot of people who may need them. And I'm really glad that you agreed to do this with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I was really impressed when you told me before we started speaking that you single-handedly are responsible for upwards of 25 people beginning their healing journey, going to therapy. That's amazing. And I'm sure you're reaching many more people with this podcast and shining a light in terms of having conversations and taking ownership over the past and rewriting your story through attentive, intentional parenting and purpose. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and thank you so much for sharing this platform with me.
I appreciate that. If people wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
So I am mainly I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And I'm under the name Dr. Gillian O'Shea Brown. The Gillian is with a G, so that's a bit of a curveball. But I'm hoping as well that you're able to maybe link some of my information underneath. But I like to share psychoeducation tips and meditations. And I also have an email list. So if you arrive on my page or on my Instagram, there's a newsletter that goes out, and it's new and emerging research or tips and tricks in terms of wellness. And, just sharing the knowledge and helping people in their own journey of self-study and healing.
Okay. And where can they find your book, and when will your second book be released?
So my first book is in Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Waterstones, if anyone's listening in Europe. And then my second book, the date of release is to be decided, but I will have all of the information mainly on my Instagram and TikTok. So all will be revealed shortly. But thank you for bringing that up, and I'll be sending you a copy.
I appreciate that. All right. Well, again, I want to say thank you for this. It's been deeply enriching and so meaningful, and has provided a wealth of knowledge and tools and education. So I'm grateful. And I want to just say again, thank you for who you are, for what you do, and for how you do it.
Thank you. And you have a forever fan of your podcast, and I hope that you continue to shine this light.